Welcome back to the Youth Bonds podcast. I'm Holin, and you are
I am Daniel.
Daniel. And today we're going to be discussing whether or not Social Security is a net benefit for society. Daniel from Massachusetts is going to be taking the affirmative. So I would like to get your opportunity to tell us why you think Social Security is a net benefit.
Absolutely. So I will just give a brief introduction about myself. My name is Daniel. I am a proud American. I'm a small business owner and a high school math teacher. I currently live and hail in Berlin, Germany. I'm living here because my wonderful, beautiful German fiance has pulled me here, and so that's sort of how I ended up here. Before I got into education, I studied international affairs and chemistry at Gordon College, and that's where I met Craig. And we were both politically active at school there, at the school, but we obviously on different ends. I'm a lifelong Democrat, admittedly not that long of a life, but as long as I've been active, I've been tending on the leftward spectrum. And yeah, thank you guys. Thank you for this evening, and I guess it's afternoon for you, but thank you for hosting this, and I'm excited. So enough about me. Yeah, let's get into Social Security. And so just to level, I think I think that Social Security is no, Social Security is one of the most successful anti-poverty programs in the history of the world. In the 90 years, actually 89 years that it has been in existence, it has elevated over 100 million Americans out of poverty. And today it provides 71 or 72 million in that ballpark Americans with over $1.5 trillion of benefits. And so this is not just a retirement scheme. This is a support for Americans with disabilities. This is supporting young mothers. It's just a whole basket of support that is just helping a lot of people and doing a lot of good. And today, just today, if we were to get rid of the Social Security, the Social Security Administration estimates that at least 22.5 million Americans would immediately be below the poverty line, including almost a million children. So again, 38% of American seniors would all be in poverty. This is about 10% are in poverty now. We would be tripling that number. This is just ridiculous. And yeah, so, and of course, being in poverty or just being above the poverty line doesn't necessarily mean that you have a high quality of living. And so this is a huge, huge, huge strain on American society. This would be a huge strain on American society. And so simply for the sake of its anti-poverty effect, just the tremendous amount of people it's impacted, I really, really strongly, strongly believe that the Social Security is a hugely important American institution that we need to protect. And sort of dialing back, Social Security has actually been a very popular program. Republicans and Democrats voted together many times to support it and build it into what it is. Obviously, everyone knows this, but it was born out of the Great Depression, an FDR program that was born in the moment when America's economy was literally at the lowest point it's ever been. Huge unemployment, I think over 20%, stock market collapse, just total wealth destruction, economic destruction, just really a terrible, terrible time to be in America, and actually not just America, but all around the world. And Social Security was one of the programs that was sort of designed and born in this era to work on helping elevate Americans out of poverty and helping people, especially seniors, who were impoverished. And so at that time, I think the estimates are not necessarily 100% clear, but the Social Security Administration estimates that around half of all American seniors did not have income, or people over 60, Americans over 65 did not have self-sustaining income and were completely dependent on their children for financial support because they were unable to work or unable to work well enough to get enough money to support themselves during that time. Huge unemployment, just a tough time to be. And so that's sort of the era that Social Security is born into. And yeah, so when most people talk about the problems of Social Security, I guess maybe this isn't the point of discussion that debate we would have, but most people point to the issue of Social Security being the funding and sustainability of Social Security. And that is, I think, one of the most important issues, maybe among the most important issues that America faces and the government faces moving forward is the solvency of the Social Security Trust Fund. It's really, really an issue. And I guess since 2022, somewhere in 2022, the expenditures have exceeded the income. And I might be wrong about the year exactly, but I think it's in the last couple of years we've
2021.
been 2021. Okay, yeah, thank you. So the last couple of years we have been spending more money on outlays than we've been receiving, and I think it's 2033 or 2034. without any changes, there will have to be benefit cuts because, well, because the financing will not, there will no longer be any money left in the pool to subsidize the benefits that are being outlaid. So again, big problem. I see the big problem being how can we make Social Security more sustainable? How can we make it last so it's a robust program that supports many Americans for many years to come? And I think, yeah, something I did want to discuss with you, and I'll just share this point, and then I hope we can come back to it again. I think this is actually a really personal thing. Of course, we are not of the age of collecting Social Security, but we are at an age when we are making the biggest and most important decisions in our life, like buying a house, starting a family, I'm building a business, raising kids, whether to start a family. These are all really, really huge decisions. And I just can't even imagine if I had to make these decisions at the same time as having to support my parents or grandparents because the rug was ripped out from under them and they immediately were completely dependent on my finances. This would be a huge, huge, huge problem for me. And I think it would be a problem for most of us. Um, and it's just ridiculous, unfair, and it's I think would be a huge, huge challenge to many in our generation as we're really, on the cusp of starting our lives. We're really at that exciting phase when the whole world is in front of us. People a little bit younger, a little bit older. We're all in this place where we're making these really exciting, cool decisions. And I think we don't want to handicap ourselves, even if we think, oh yeah, I'm not collecting now, but I will in the future. And even if you aren't in the future, your parents or your grandparents will be, and pulling the rug from out from under them would be a huge, huge, huge yeah, just a huge cancer for our society to imagine swallowing. And I think I would love to talk about funding of Social Security. We can talk about that separately, maybe. But I guess I would just finish saying that America is the richest, most powerful country in the history of the world. And the least we can do, what's the point of having all this money if we can't take care of our own poor? And I'm absolutely 100% a believer in economic growth. I think it's a hugely important thing. Like, I am not yeah, I'm not a far lefty. I think I believe we need to get the economic engine of America going, and I'm absolutely open to finding ways that we can do that. I'm sure there's ways and points of disagreement that we'll find. I think economic growth is important, but I also think economic growth on its own, is not the absolute final good. We need to take care of each other. And Social Security is just a small thing. Well, actually, it's a big thing, a big government program, but it's a big program and it helps so many people and it helps all of us. Even if we're not collecting now, we could be collecting in the future. It helps people with disabilities, even if you're younger. It helps us by basically supporting our parents and grandparents. And yeah, I really think it's an important thing. And of course, we can talk about funding and different issues there. And I'm very excited to hear about why you think Social Security is, in fact, a great cancer.
Well, unfortunately, you have spent quite a bit of time there just defending one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in world history. Social Security meets the definition of the SEC's criteria for a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme, by definition, is the new investors pay off the old investors, and unfortunately, that's what is happening in Social Security. And just like any other Ponzi scheme, you see now it is coming to a horrible ending. The first people who collected Social Security were making out like bandits. I mean, they were living to these old ages and they could collect Social Security benefits for all these years, and they only had to pay in for a couple, and it was great. But of course, the new investors do great in a Ponzi scheme. The late investors, the ones that hold the bag. And that's exactly what's happening right now. As you see, I mean, what Social Security has turned into, unfortunately, is it is a transfer of wealth from young, working, poor people to rich, older people. The average net worth of somebody who collects Social Security is far greater than the people who are paying into Social Security by a factor of more than three. These people are much richer, much older on average, and you have very, very wealthy people collecting Social Security from people who can't afford to buy houses. And so these are the people that are holding the bag. The younger generation, unfortunately, is holding the bag for this Ponzi scheme created by the United States government. Of course, the poverty rate fell in the Great Depression, or since the Great Depression in the elderly community. I mean, we have had insane amounts of economic growth since then. That's in spite of Social Security, not because of Social Security. That's single factor analysis. You can't just say because of Social Security we are now richer. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, it's insane. I mean, the reason an economy grows is that you have capital increasing and you figure out more productive ways to produce goods and services. And so, of course, we're richer now than we ever have been because we have far more capital than we ever have had, and we're much better at producing goods and services than we ever have been. And that's amazing. But unfortunately, Social Security is a burden on the economy. It's funny because the workers that pay into Social Security, they would be making more money if they weren't paying money into Social Security in the first place. I mean, what do you think your employer does with FICA? I mean, he could pay you the money or he could send it to the government. So the younger employees, instead of being able to save for their retirement, are paying the money to the United States government instead. And they're paying it to people who are much richer, who are far more likely to be able to pay for emergency expenses, who have far more net worth, are doing far better off financially. And these young people who, I mean, 30, I mean, so many young people, they're living with their parents. They're struggling so much right now. And they're just paying off these rich people. And so that is unfortunately what's going on here. Now, of course, when the Social Security Fund was first started, when Social Security first started, we had far more people paying into Social Security than were collecting benefits. Now, as you mentioned, we are now running these huge deficits. Social Security, $100 billion last year, $100 billion of Treasury sold. This whole thing is we have too many collecting. I mean, whenever Social Security first started, for every one person that was collecting Social Security, about 158 people were working. Now it's about 2.3. And that number is continuing to get lower and lower because the average age people are living is much greater now than it used to be. And so you have all these people collecting Social Security benefits, but you have too few people working. And these very few amount of people that are working are holding the back. So yes, the projection right now, it was 2034, but now it's getting to 2023 that the Social Security Trust Fund is going to be bankrupt. And I think those are optimistic expectations at best. I mean, Social Security is running these massive deficits. They have to index for the cost of living and for wage gains. So these are going to be massive increases in Social Security if you look at the projections. It's just a ticking time bomb. At some point, Social Security is going to be bankrupt. And so I mean the government is going to have to come in and step in and try and it's going to be either massive increase in payroll taxes to fund this or massive amounts of inflation for the government to prop it up because they're already running these huge deficits. I mean, where's the Fed going to, or where's the money going to get, the government going to get the money to fund this? They're going to have to ask the Fed to come to the rescue and print the money for them. But I mean, I mean, Social Security, abolishing Social Security would allow people to save for their retirement. If we lived in a world of hard money and we didn't have all this, we didn't have this fiat Ponzi, then people would just be able to hold on to money and their money over time wouldn't be constantly destroyed in value. And they would be able to save for their retirements themselves. And even in a world right now where the investment industry, like for retirement industry, is maybe 10 to 100 times larger than it would be in a world of hard money, you still would get much higher returns if you just save for your own retirement, right? You would get it doesn't even come close the amount of returns you would have saving yourself instead of having the government doing it for you, because the government is just taking that money. You send it to the government with payroll taxes on FICA. They take that money and they just blow it on consumption. I mean, they get the Social Security Trust Fund will basically just get treasuries. The government will swap a treasury bond and give it a treasury bond, and they will take that money that they get from Social Security and they'll just blow it on consumption. And so, I mean, it's not actually being invested, right? Government spending isn't an investment. It's just consumption. That's all government spending is. So the government isn't actually trying to grow the economy. They're actually making our lives better. And that's where the Social Security money is actually going. And so, unfortunately, it's a huge burden on the United States. I mean, imagine the economic growth that would have taken place in the United States had we not had Social Security. The amount of economic capital that was taken out of the economy, out of the hands of employers and workers to fund this Ponzi scheme is astronomical. And the fact that it's lasted this long is just a testament to how much we've increased living standards since then and how amazing capitalism has been to the extent that we've had it. So, I mean, and so you could, if you actually look at what Social Security did, and you say, oh, okay, well, we had Social Security and poverty rates have declined, and so that therefore Social Security is good. I just challenge you to please think a little bit deeper through that because clearly that's nonsense. I mean, I'm not trying to be mean to you there. It's a fantasy. Ask any. I mean, it's just not true. I mean, but anyway, I'd say kids need a fresh start. You're talking about kids needing a fresh start. I mean, I totally agree that kids need a fresh start. I mean, kids are doing horrible right now. And that is largely because of Social Security. They have to pay Social Security taxes, and the government has to, they got to pay out all this money. And where's the money coming from? It's coming from people who are working. And most of those people are younger and they're trying to get ahead, but they can't. So, I mean, of course they can, but it's much, much harder than it otherwise would be because we have Social Security. So this is a program, of course, that neither parties want to cut because the moment you talk about trying to cut Social Security, I mean, it's a voting issue, right? This is another problem with democracy. You got all these people that if you say we're going to cut Social Security, this is a Ponzi scheme, this is ridiculous. Uh, we need to cut this. This is horrible for the long-term growth of the economy. You explain the problems of Social Security, why it's bad for them, and then these people are just going to go ahead and be like, I'm not going to vote for you because that's my money. And that's exactly the problem that you have now. Once you get these Ponzi schemes in the first place and you got all this money being handed out to people, it's extraordinarily difficult to actually get rid of it because you have all of these people voting that are receiving money from the government. So that's exactly what you're seeing right now. I mean, there's a lot more to say, but I'll just stop right there.
I would, yeah, thank you. I would like to very quickly respond to the point about Social Security and poverty reduction. I think you're completely wrong, or maybe we have a misunderstanding. Um, Obviously, economic growth is a big part of how our society has prospered and how the world continues to prosper and grow. But it is just objectively correct that Social Security has lifted millions and tens of millions, hundreds of millions of Americans out of poverty. Hundreds of millions of Americans that over time, I'm not talking about right now in any one specific moment, I'm talking about over the last 89, 90 years of Social Security's existence. It was born in a moment when over half of seniors were basically completely impoverished, and it lifted so many of them to actually be able to sustain themselves. So, just very quickly on that point, I think it's very, very important that all of your listeners understand that Social Security, while there might be certain drags on the economy by increasing taxes and reducing capital flows, it absolutely is redistributive, and it allows the economy, like the wealth of our society, to support the people who really, really need it the most, and many seniors who need it the most. Now, on the point of it, whether it being a Ponzi scheme, this is actually like a classically debunked trope about Social Security that still gets a lot of airwaves. Again, Ponzi schemes, like you might be able to say, like technically it fits the definition, but only because we're choosing not to fund it. If we chose to fund it properly, as we should continue to reform and work on the funding mechanisms for it, we absolutely would be having a sustainable system here. It has had a surplus up until 2 years ago, as we have discussed. And I think in 2010, it had like a huge surplus. So we are talking about a lot of money that we've just not done. We've not been good stewards of the financing. And there's a lot of ways we can adjust how the Social Security Fund can stay solvent. We can have a good faith discussion about raising the retirement age. Absolutely. That should be on the table. It doesn't make sense that we would have to keep the same system that was created in place in the 30s and 40s. Now, of course, we can raise the retirement age. Of course, we can practice means testing. It doesn't make sense for young people to be subsidizing the retirements of very, very, very rich old people. Of course, there should be means testing. Of course, we should phase things out for the highest earners. And absolutely, we can talk about the financing. There's a lot of really interesting things we can do that would make the program more sustainable. I would say one of the fastest way, there's three things that would make this all go away basically instantly. We can just eliminate the Social Security tax limit. That is just absurd. That allows the richest Americans to disproportionately benefit from Social Security while paying less into the Social Security pot. And secondly, of course, we can deal with this whole problem of the ratio of people paying into the pot by allowing more Americans to work, more people to work in America, because anyone working in America is paying payroll taxes, whether they're an American or not. And there are lots and lots of people who would be happy to come to our country and work. And every new worker is going to be paying payroll taxes, whether or not they ever get to collect it. And so increasing immigration, of course, raising retirement age, these are simple fixes we can do. I also think, eliminating the Social Security tax limit would be a very important place to start. In addition, we're just talking about when we're not really discussing whether or not the program is good or bad at this point. We're talking about like how we can fund it to make it sustainable here. That's the most important thing. We need to help people. We need to help the program help more people. And whether that is perhaps not extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that would unlock $2-3 trillion in extra revenue for the government. Whether it's raising taxes, there's lots of ways we can do this. There's doesn't necessarily have to be only one solution, but the main thing is we need to find better, more sustainable ways to create this a better and more sustainable funding structure for the future.
The Social Security meets the criteria for a Ponzi scheme the way it's funded. You acknowledge that, right?
I acknowledge that as it currently exists, it's not sustainable, but that's different from a Ponzi scheme.
I'm saying, is it a Ponzi scheme?
No, absolutely not.
Why not?
Because it's run a surplus. Most of it in the last 30, 40 years, it's been
There, so if a
financially
so
solvent and
so if
making
something
money.
if something runs a Ponzi scheme, if something runs a surplus, it's not a Ponzi scheme. So Bernie
No,
Madoff,
your definition before was that you're basically financing the retirements of older people based on the work and earnings of younger people.
no,
That's your
the definition of a
definition.
Ponzi scheme, I'm saying that's what it's doing. But a Ponzi scheme is when new investors pay off old investors. It's a form of fraud where new investors pay off old investors. That is exactly what's going on here.
Okay, but that's yes, new investors are paying off old investors only because we are not properly funding the system. And
But
we can discuss like how we should be investing. The Social Security Trust Fund is only allowed to buy bonds, and we could actually, I would love to have a discussion about whether that's the most efficient way, because surely bonds are not the best return on investment. And there are ways to take our investments and actually turn that into a growth engine for the economy to stimulate demand and also to actually like use the money that has been put in to grow wealth in the trust fund to finance everyone's retirement, everyone's benefit.
yeah, I mean,
It doesn't have to be.
the thing is, we could talk about what it should be, what reforms we can make, all that kind of stuff, and that's all great and dandy. But the problem is this is what it is. I'm saying Social Security, as it stands, is a Ponzi scheme by definition, and the fact, just not being able to acknowledge that, I think, speaks volumes to the situation here. I mean, it's a very much it's a huge fraud. I mean, clearly, this is what this is, and unfortunately, it's helping to bankrupt the United States. I mean, the Social Security lifting people out of poverty. I mean, I honestly, dude, I try and say to people to stick to whatever their discipline is. For me, I am an economist. I just focus on economics because that's what I know in this world better than anything, and I still don't know much about it. Okay, and one thing that is true about economics is that your economy can only grow without it, you will have diminishing returns if your economy does not increase capital. Okay, and so the Social Security, taking people's money and then spending it on administrative costs and then sending it to another person does not grow the economy. What grows the economy is engaging in capital investment and increasing capital. That grows the economy. None of that is happening in Social Security. Social Security is just subsidizing people who aren't working. It's literally encouraging people to be unproductive. I mean, it's shown, and it crowds out people from saving for their own retirement. So think about, all right, go back to the whole history of Social Security. All of these people, all of these years, instead of taking that money that was taken in payroll taxes, if they would have put that in their own, they would have done their own pensions, their own investment portfolios. Think about all the companies that would have gotten money that never gotten money. But because the government has taken that capital out of the economy, it's no longer there anymore. And they swapped this money for government bonds. And the government has spent all this money on consumption. So all of these, we've missed out on so much thanks to this Ponzi scheme, which is Social Security. But I mean, I appreciate the fact that you're willing to make reforms. I mean, clearly, nobody else really. I mean, very little people are willing to make reforms here. I mean, they'll talk about making reforms, but they're not even serious about it. And I mean, clearly, it needs to be reformed because it is a Ponzi scheme. It's running out of money, and there's just not enough people working at this point in time to actually make the program sustainable. There's not enough. You could raise the payroll tax, but how many? But you're just going to discourage people from working. Right. So, I mean, you got to figure out where on the Laffer curve, I guess they would call it in economics, where it's viable to, get people uh, to work at the same time while paying as many taxes as possible, to maximize tax rate and get the most amount of people working for the highest amount of tax rate. And of course, we don't want to tax people. We want people to be free. We want taxes to be low. We want people to spend money with how they see fit. The government sucks at centrally planning welfare, and this is exactly what's going on here. The private sector is better. It's much more efficient. There's much less waste. And this is exactly why you want the private sector doing this. You want charities doing this. You want people doing this voluntarily. This is the government effectively saying you have to give me money and we're going to forcefully make you participate in our investment Ponzi scheme, or else this is what, or else nothing. It's just the government using force. You have to participate in this social security Ponzi scheme that we have created, and your employer does too. All right, all these employers have to pay money into this stuff as well. It used to be that if you were self-employed, the government figured you were smart enough to save for your own retirement, so you didn't have to, you don't have to be in Social Security. But now they have to pay double effectively because they have to pay for themselves and as the employer, so they effectively are doing the 12-4. So, I mean, it's a disaster. You got it's so funny to me because people want to act like they're pro-choice, and I say, okay, well, you would say that it's fair that people should be able to choose to pay to save for their own retirement, right? No, what? Why? Well, where's the consistency at? I mean, shouldn't people be able to save for their own retirement? I mean, this is crazy stuff. I mean, these are grown adults making decisions in the real world. And the government needs to be, we need a nanny state that's over here centrally planning people's retirement with some Ponzi scheme investment fraud. I mean, this is ridiculous. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's very sad looking at the situation, looking at what could have been but was not, thanks to in part to Social Security and welfare in general, the community aspect of the society that has been missed out on, the churches, the charities, all of the stuff that would have, given people capital that would have never been taken by the government. It's very interesting to think about that we all basically are, we're not all, but a lot of Americans are relying on the government now instead of their neighbors, and thanks to this program. And so the government is basically doing the bidding for them just forcefully instead of voluntarily. But I mean, I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, I think that obviously I would have a fundamental disagreement about like the merits of taxation in general. So, um, putting a pin in that point, I think we can come back to it. I do think
Sure.
that, um, yeah, I think that when we talk about economic growth in absolute terms, yes, of course, taxation is a complicated way of moving money around, and it's regressive, it's redistributing. We're talking about redistribution of money and assets and capital. And so not necessarily always going to be allocated most efficiently. And if the efficiency of capital allocation is the absolute North Star, then of course, taxation, government spending, all of this would be a net negative. But we live in the real world. We live in an imperfect society where people aren't always kind to each other, where people, despite our best intentions, like we do need support. We need regulation to make sure we're not polluting our water. We need to make sure that there's roads are paved. We need to make sure that our kids are getting education. Like these are really, really, really important things. And in times like these, like we have to finance a well-manned, well-supported and well-supplied military. Like these are not cheap things. These are very expensive things, and we need them as a society. No man is an island. We do not get to exist in autonomy. None of us were just born into this world perfectly prepared to thrive independently of everything in society. Like we need society. We are as much connected to the people in the world around us as we are independent. Of course, our selfishness, our desire, our drive to our ambition can be a very powerful engine for economic growth. And that's why I think capitalism is a fabulous way to organize society so that we can all be pursuing our own interests. But we are not existing alone. Like, of course, we have our own ambitions, but we are fostered in a society that takes care of us. We grew up going to schools. We drive on roads that are paved and paid for. We live and we survive in our countries because our countries are protected and kept safe by the strongest military in the history of the world. That is absolutely an expensive in blood and treasure. It's expensive to protect our freedom. And to just dismiss this all as like unnecessary fantasy is ridiculous. We live in the real world, and we also have a lot of people around us who have a lot less. Of course, we might be fortunate enough to make enough money to set aside money to as savings for our retirement, but most Americans don't. And most Americans really feel the pinch of inflation, of just the rising cost of living, buying a house. It's really expensive. It's tough to get around these days. Of course, taxes are another burden on ourselves, but they come with the benefit of we are taking care of all of us, taking care of all of us. This is a small price to pay to live in a society that allows us to thrive. And you might be of the position that if we remove some of these taxes, we would thrive more. But I absolutely disagree because I agree that we probably could sit down and find lots of places where we could reduce government fat or find ways to run things more efficiently, finance things more efficiently. But at the end of the day, we absolutely need government. We need collective organized bodies that help us to be the best of ourselves and allow us to be selfishly pursuing the best things for ourselves. Because without schools, without paved roads, without the internet, what we can't just like poop out economic growth. That's not how it works.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
all of this stuff is the stuff you mentioned, roads, or that's an economic good, and it could be provided for much better, much more efficiently, much higher quality, much safer. If it was provided for privately, I mean, this has been demonstrated several times, but all of these government functions are just provided for in a confiscatory way, in a very inefficient way, thanks to the government essentially planning whatever good they want to produce without economic calculation and in with force. So I mean, yeah, I mean, the government does a bunch of stuff. The government is so involved in our lives. The government is massive today. It's spending $7.4 trillion dollars a year. And of course, the largest line item in the federal budget is Social Security when it comes to the federal government. Of course, the state and local governments as well, if you combine federal, state, local, you're looking at about 38.8% of the United States GDP is government spending. And so it's about $12 trillion dollars a year. So,
A lot of money. Yeah.
but of course, yeah, I mean, and all of that
Yeah.
money, all government spending is not investment. It doesn't grow the economy. That's a fantasy. Government spending is consumption. That's what government spending is. The private sector produces stuff. We produce goods and services, and we produce stuff. The government just comes there and takes money from the private sector. That's the only way the government can get money to spend in the first place. I produce something, and the government steals that from me. That's literally what the government does. Without the ability to take stuff from the private sector, the government has nothing. So the government is literally the existence of government, the way that the government spends is only possible because of the private sector's production. That's the only way somebody can consume is if somebody else produces. Without somebody else's production, there is no consumption. Okay, so all of these social security benefits had to come from somebody. Who is it coming from? It's coming from people who are working. These people who are working are subsidizing your retirement, and that's unfortunately what's going on here. So if you care about like the cost of living, people can't afford stuff and all this kind of crap, the people who are working are the vast majority of people who are struggling financially right now. The people who are receiving Social Security benefits, those people are doing far better financially than the ones who are working because the people who are working are subsidizing them. So if you really care about these guys, why wouldn't you want to cut these Social Security benefits and taxes? Because these people are going to be able to afford stuff much better now because their money's being confiscated by the government. All of these functions that you talked about with the government, all of them could be provided for much better privately. And so, and defending this essentially planned Ponzi scheme that the government has created with the welfare state, I think is it's while it's well intentioned, and I understand that we want to be equitable and all this kind of stuff, and it's just we could all be equally poor. We could all and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's not while it's well intentioned, it's just not effective in the real world, really. And so we're facing the consequences right now. I mean, but yeah, I'll just leave it at that for now.
Yeah, I would really like to counter this point. I think you're generally right that the majority of government expenditures, like we're taxing money, we're taxing capital, we're taking money out of the economy, and we're pushing it towards consumption. Like that's what generally the government financing is doing. That's what taxes, spending, tax and spend. That's what's going on. But actually, this Social Security Trust Fund is like explicitly not supposed to be that. And that's where I think this disconnection is real. Like this disconnect is really important. Yes, it's functioning right now because we haven't financed it properly. It's functioning that we're paying in to support the retirements of people now. But that's not at all what it's supposed to be designed to do. We can say it should be designed better, but the whole point of Social Security is that it's supposed to be growing wealth inside the trust fund. The trust fund is not supposed to just exist on the simple monthly contributions of payroll taxes. That's absolutely not what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be growing. I think that only being allowed to invest in government bonds is a problem, and I would absolutely love to see that reform changing. But again, like if we would allow to be fully funded and not rob it when we need to subsidize the rest of the government, we would actually have a growing pie. The Social Security Trust Fund does not need to be this like it doesn't need to exist as a Ponzi scheme as you call it. It exists like that because we are not allowing it to grow wealth in its own. Like it should be acquiring assets. There's wealth funds all around the world that finance Social Security, and they finance it based on building a pie. We are not allowing it. We are not allowing the trust fund to be financed sufficiently so that it can actually accumulate assets that build wealth, so that we can pay for the retirements not exclusively based on the contributions and payroll taxes, but on the payroll taxes that have been collected, and then the assets that those have purchased, and then the interest on those assets and the appreciation of those assets can be financing all of our prosperity together. And of course, we can find more efficient ways to do everything. That's something that's cool about economics. You can learn about things in a perfect world. This would make sense. But we don't live in that perfect world. We live in a very broken world where people struggle. People need we need to have rules. We need to have boundaries, and we need to take care of each other. And I agree that there is it's sad to see how society doesn't. We don't necessarily take care of each other as much as we should. And I don't think that is because of the government stepping in the way. I think that is a deeper problem. And I think that if we together decided we wanted to take care of each other better, we could actually do that. We don't need to wait for the government to get out of the way to start helping our neighbors, to start helping the people in our community. This is not something we need to be doing. Churches, community groups, all of
Yeah.
the like we don't need to wait for the government to get out of the way.
But
We can do it first.
but the government is taking so much of their income. That's the thing. Like the government is, we have this massive government. I just told you that the government is spending basically 40% of GDP, 38.8%.
That's a
They're
lot of
taking
money,
so
of
much of
course.
their money. Their money's being stolen. And so if they don't have much left over to give to their neighbors. I mean, would you be willing to, don't you think that plays a factor?
I think it definitely plays a factor, of course, like having lower amount of money because of taxes, of course, makes is a factor, but also the tax burden is like the benefit, the cost benefit analysis of like what the government is giving us for our taxes. It's not nothing. Like it's not just a net negative. Like it's supported. We're supporting a lot of things that we all need, like subsidizing the healthcare of poor people. Yeah, okay, it's not. It's taking money from me to support people who have less money. Okay, it's less good for me, but it's helping people who do not have the support better. It's giving them this care that they need.
Yeah, I mean, all of these stuff, trying to essentially plan it like these sovereign wealth fund ideas and all this kind of stuff is just status nonsense. I mean, all of this stuff, the economy is going to be the most efficient, the most productive. The living standards will increase the fastest when you leave it to the private sector. And when the government is trying to get involved in healthcare, or trying to get involved in roads, or it's trying to get involved in anything really, it's just going to create a giant disaster because they don't have to be productive with the product or service that they are offering you. Imagine having a customer and that customer had to pay you regardless of whether or not the service was good, and you held a gun to their head saying you have to pay me. I mean, do you think the service is going to be really good? I mean, I do lawns, right? Let's say for a neighborhood I do lawns in, I told everybody in that neighborhood, I said, hey, you have to pay me no matter what. And if you don't, you're going to go into a jail cell. And every day you have to pay me. And by the way, I have this 70,000 page tax code on how you have to pay me. So you have to figure it out and hire an accountant to do it. I mean, do you think I'm really going to be efficient at the product or service that I'm providing? And by the way, if you use Social Security, as I don't want to get too far off here with the government because I have a billion things to say about the government and we shouldn't go over it in this video. I'm trying to keep it about Social Security. Social Security is just another way of the government essentially planning retirement with the same principle in that it's coercive. And the thing is if you allow it to buy things, like let's say you allow it to buy stocks. I mean, this is going to be massive cronyism in the economy. And this is going to be like the government is going to be choosing which companies that they put money into. Like, do you imagine that ending out well? Do you think it's a good thing? Of course, it's not a good thing. You're coercing money away from me to buy companies. I mean, that's ridiculous. You want people to make these decisions for themselves. And so, yeah, I mean, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I would, again, I just think maximum economic efficiency isn't the only point. I think it's one of the most important things that we need to really work on getting, like organizing the engine of capitalism, organizing the engine of the private sector, organizing capital investment. This is all really, really important to a thriving and prosperous economy. But it's not the only point. It's not the North Star. It's not the only thing that matters. We need to take care of each other. And yes, of course, if we had more money, we could be more generous. But guess what? People who have a lot of money aren't always very generous. And so that's not just a magic bullet. We have suffering all over the world. And it's not just because we are suddenly the wealthiest we've ever been in the history of humanity doesn't mean we've abolished poverty. And again, there are lots of inefficiencies in the way that these big government programs are operating. And I agree that we should work in good faith to try to reform them so that we can make them more efficient. But that doesn't mean getting or doing away with them.
You can't.
That's my point. Is that we can use investments instead of just investing in very poor returning bonds. Okay, yes, there's always going to be a conflict of interest, but of course, buying bonds from yourself is also a conflict of interest. I'm sure you would agree with that.
Yeah, this shouldn't exist. Let's go. Let's abolish it.
So again, no, but again, it's like there's always going to be when you're collecting assets, when you're acquiring wealth through taxation, there will be, of course, if you just kept it in cash, there'd be no return. But the point is we want to maximize the return. We want to improve the return that the trust fund can earn so that it's not just paying out based on the payroll taxes, but it's actually paying out based on the returns, the wealth that's accruing and the money that's growing from interest and from the capital gains from the full pie is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, like it has been for most of the history of Social Security. It's actually been a growing pie. It's only recently that we've started to have this issue of the pie shrinking because we're not contributing enough and we're not making the actual technical adjustments that we need to make it more sustainable. And that's what I'm here for. I want to make it sustainable. And I think that, like you said earlier, there aren't really a lot of serious people in politics who do truly care about making things more sustainable. I think it's a lot of delay as long as we can. And I was talking to Greg about this, or I don't know if I was talking to him, I was talking to one of my other Republican friends that I actually think this might be the most underrated thing that has been a part of Donald Trump's success is that he has basically taken the cutting out of entitlements from the Republican platform, and it's always been a wedge issue among the working class. And so by ripping that out of the Republican platform, I mean, it's been a huge political dividends. And so,
of course, that's what I was saying earlier. Like once these programs are here, you can't get rid of them, or else you're not going to be voted into office. And so it creates this huge moral hazard where you continue to confiscate money from poor working people and giving it to richer older people, or you get your votes, or you stop confiscating money from poor working people and now you've lost votes of older richer people. So it creates this huge moral hazard, and that's exactly what you're seeing. So the idea, do you think like, okay, so let's say someone makes a lot of money. That doesn't mean that let's say they're selfish, right? They're selfish. They don't want to give it to anybody, which is, by the way, most of the time not true. Most wealthy people do give their money away a lot. And so like, let's say there is a wealthy person though, who doesn't want to give their money away. It's not your property. That's their property. They earned that money. It's their own money. It's not my job to take that money away from them. I don't have any justification stealing their money from them. It's absolutely ridiculous. Are we pro-choice here? Don't we want people to keep their own money if they so decide? And they get rich in the first place because they're helping people. I mean, that's the only way you could actually make money. If you have a really rich person, they're making money because they're making people's lives better. And they actually help to make the economy grow. And when the economy grows, that disproportionately helps out poor people. Poor people get out of poverty faster. Isn't this amazing? Like the economy isn't a zero-sum game. And I agree with you. We should get immigration. And I agree with you, like that this would be amazing. Like this would make the economy grow even faster. It would be amazing for productivity. It would be amazing for capital if we got a bunch of people here and we should make reforms to Social Security. But you're making reforms in that we should keep Social Security. You're saying we should have immigrants to make Social Security more solvent, and of course they pay much more into Social Security than they take out. But that's not the point. The point is to abolish it altogether. That would be the ideal scenario, is to get rid of this investment fraud and return the money back to people and let them decide what they want to do with their own money. And so that they'll be much better off that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're probably coming close to the end of this. I think fundamentally, I disagree on the point that uh, taxation is intrinsically immoral. I think that obviously I have no problem with people building wealth. I think it's a tremendous achievement of like humanity, capitalism. It's amazing. Like up until about 250 years ago, like the entire economic pie of the world, like basically was unchanged for thousands and thousands of years. And it's only because of like this tremendous, like the political organization that created capitalism and that allowed us to form institutions that created this wealth. It's just tremendous. It's an achievement of humanity and society. And America is one of the most important. We've just benefited so much from this. So don't misunderstand me. I absolutely am not against rich people. That's not my point. My point is that taxation is not fundamentally immoral because we also do not exist autonomously. Like we became rich in a society that allowed us to flourish.
Yeah, can
Uh,
you see my screen right here?
let me just pivot. Let me finish quickly, and then we can
Oh, okay,
talk
my
about the
bad. I
debt
didn't
clock.
know you're done.
So I think like we don't exist in autonomy. The wealth of like any individual's wealth is not exclusively because like they only they worked hard and absent all the support around them, public schools and roads and all these things, like it all works together. Like you are not an island. I am not an island. Like we are working hard. We're hardworking Americans and we earn a lot for that, or we hopefully are earning a lot for that. And we still are dependent. It's not, it takes a village. Like we're dependent on our parents and our grandparents. We're dependent on the community around us. We can't devalue that to the point of nothing. So taxation finances all of that. Taxation allows us to live in a society that supports us so that we can take chances, so that we can start companies, so we can start businesses. It lets us have something to fall back on so that we can actually do the hard work of building a better and brighter future and a better economy for all of us. So yes, you can go ahead and show us the debt box.
Oh well, I mean, it's just crazy. The division of labor naturally emerges out of human action and out of humans, and for just from praxeology, people will figure out that the division of labor is much more effective for them, and you get peaceful cooperation through trade. And trade is voluntary. That's why it's amazing. You want people to trade with one another, and that's going to make sure people benefit and the economy will grow, and that's going to be amazing. But you want people to trade with one another. That builds society. That builds cooperation. That builds that's what builds really relationships too, is trade. I mean, to some degree. So now coercion is the opposite. It makes time preference rise instead of fall. Coercion destroys. And so, generally speaking, so you don't want coercion, and that's exactly what the government is coercion. And so, this idea, I mean, roads, schools, all this stuff is much better provided for privately, much more
I don't think
efficiently.
that's true. I would love to hear an example of where that's been successful. I've traveled a lot. I've been to dozens and dozens of countries, and I've been to places that have very weak states. And I can confirm that without a doubt, every single weak state I've been to where the government is not providing services is a poor state, and a state where there might be a few people that are really wealthy, but the majority of society is squalling in anguish, like suffering in anguish. And yeah, I can think of a few examples. Sri Lanka, a couple of years ago, I was there and the government was basically falling apart. And they had allowed some private roads to be built, and so there were very, very, very nice highways that you would have to pay to get on, and they were wonderful. They indebted the country, and no one used them. And so it's just an example of like it's nice to allow rich people or people to build private things, but they're not they're not all public goods. Everyone can't access them. People lose their minds when they have to pay a toll anyway. Like imagine every single road being a toll road. Like it's just not going to work.
Yeah, I mean it's a good example of this is in the early 19th century in turnpike trusts. Unfortunately, the government is has confiscated a bunch of land and built roads themselves, and so the private sector value proposition for building roads is much lower because the government doesn't have the economic calculation necessary to know if they're overproducing roads or underproducing roads. So they'll end up overproducing them, and so we have too many roads now, and we have a bunch of land that's being wasted basically because of it. And it's much lower quality, and we have much more deaths than we would have privately. But of course, the government or the food is provided for privately at low cost, and it's much more efficient than what would be if the government provided it. And so, do we need the government to provide food for poor people? Do we need the government to provide, hey, this is ridiculous. Of course, it's going to be crap. If the government tries to provide food, it's going to be terrible. It's no different with roads. It's much worse than it otherwise would be. Now, richer people get better, higher quality food than poor people do. And is that, does that mean the government should come in and try and fix this problem? My God, we're not
No,
equal.
definitely
Of
not.
course
Definitely
not.
not.
It's the same with
Of
roads.
course, no, it's not the
Poor
same with
people
roads
would
because
have,
roads are an important part of the economic engine of society. Like roads are one of the main things that have allowed America to become as prosperous. It's allowed so many countries to become prosperous. When you connect societies and when you connect people within societies and you connect the economic engines of societies and you allow people to commute, you just it just grows the pie in so many ways. America's investment in infrastructure has been a huge, maybe not recently, but in the past has been a huge engine of economic growth and prosperity for the country.
yeah, I mean, you could, the government spending is not investment. It's just stolen money from taxpayers. You want the private sector to perform economic calculation at the margin and decide whether or not we need a road or we need a railway or whatever the case may be. And so travel is much less efficient in the United States than it otherwise would be had the private sector decided what the land should be used for and what all that kind of stuff should be used for. All that and all of that stuff that the government is building for us is just stolen money that they're just consuming resources or our goods with, and it's companies that are providing these roads. Of course, they're just stealing our money and paying some company to build roads where they think is best. I mean, that's what's going on
I
here.
think no, but I think the main fundamental difference is that I think that it's the point isn't to only operate in the position of maximum efficiency or maximum cost effectiveness. There are fundamentally things that are not cost effective, but we still need to do them as a society. One of those things, many of those, there's so many of these things. Healthcare for people who are have uh, pre-existing conditions. This is an example of something that as a society, it is not economically efficient for us to do that. It's not. It's economically inefficient to provide healthcare for the person who is sick, but it is the right thing to do. And just because it's not the most efficient thing to do, we just can't have our North Star focused exclusively on efficiency. And I think that's where we fundamentally disagree, because I also would say
But
maybe
that's
bringing healthcare in is the wrong, maybe that's too much of a pivot. I would bring it back to Social Security and say,
yeah.
I think that providing care for the elderly, providing care for the disabled, of course, there's more efficient ways we could do it. And I would love to work on efficiency within the system, but it's never going to be economically like profitable for some company to be providing uh, financial support to someone who has disabilities and can't work. That's just never going to be financially in anyone's incentive how the system, how we live in society now. So we have a world where we do need to take care of people. And of course, in a utopic society where everyone had equal access to all these things, like, yeah, okay, maybe we wouldn't need to have a state providing, but we don't live in that world. We live in reality. In reality, like there's lots of things that are unfair, and the government can't make everything fair for everyone, of course. But there are things that are not efficient that the government has to step in and do. It's never going to be financially efficient for any one or group of people to support a military to defend themselves. Of course, it's not efficient. It's like so expensive, and the cost to me is like so nominal. Like me as an individual, how much do I benefit from the U.S. military protecting American assets around the world? Like it's like incalculable to me. Like it's the marginal benefit to me and the marginal cost to me is like so uh, it's so complex and complicated that of course the government there needs to be an organizing structure that basically coerces society to finance these things because they're important, not because they're efficient.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're misconstruing what I'm saying, which I'm not saying that it needs to be the most efficient. That's not what that's a part of it. I want things to be more efficient. That's definitely true. But fundamentally, I want to see a society that is the best for human flourishing. And it doesn't, nothing comes close to capitalism. Nothing comes close to private property, property rights, a market economy. Nothing even, it's not even a discussion. So, really, so when it comes to Social Security, this is no different. I don't want the government centrally planning my retirement. I think that if it were handled privately, in fact, I know if it were handled privately, people would have much more money when they retire in the long run, and they would be far better off. And working people, especially who are paying and subsidizing these older, richer people, would be better off. And the economy would be growing much faster than it otherwise would be had Social Security not existed. So that is my North Star is human flourishing. I mean, we could debate all day. I mean, I don't want to make this a topic about the role of government. Of course, I don't think the government should exist. And you are, you are not in that. You think the
Yeah,
government should provide all
obviously
this stuff.
disagreement there. Yeah.
So
Well, I don't think it should provide everything, but I think it's
no, I
important, and
didn't
I
say.
think there are certain functions that are always going to make sense for the private sector to dominate in and control. And like, I'm absolutely like, I think it's important. It's so important for the government to stay in its lane in a lot of places. And I think that like providing, it doesn't need to be the only game in town, but it needs to be there, and it needs to provide support for a lot of people. And in certain situations where the like capitalism isn't going to put the bill. We have the tragedy of the commons. Like there's certain things that like if we all are left to our own devices, we're not going to cooperate in the most optimal way. And the government can be an organizational force that coercively forces us to not perfectly all the time, but ideally would get us organized in a way that allows us to actually flourish more. But I definitely do not want to step on. I I think this is hopefully we can agree on this, that yes, capitalism is very important. And in the majority of sectors, capitalism should be absolutely encouraged to flourish. And that's a big part of how we will continue to grow and have grown to be as prosperous as we are. I just also think we don't want to have the tragedy of the commons here. There's a lot of places where the government steps in to avoid the tragedy of the commons. And
Yeah, I
Social
mean,
Security is one of those things.
the tragedy of the commons is not the problem. The government is, but we could talk about that for a while. But Social Security, particularly, I think that to wrap up with Social Security, I think that the idea here is that people should be the idea. One point that I think should be made, because I think that you are basically implying that if you just leave people to their own devices, then all of these people who are disabled and can't work and all this kind of crap, you're just going to see no help, right? There's not going to be basically the government needs to do this function. And it's not the true. I mean, back in and correct me if I'm strawmanning this. I mean, I think that's pretty much where I'm getting at. Um, but uh, but you see, before we had an income tax and a Federal Reserve in the United States, we had a huge culture of giving in the United States. We had a huge culture of charity, and rich people used to give their money all the time to people who were disabled and unable to work. And that was something that what the culture was. The government didn't do that. That was just something you gave to your neighbor. And so like it's interesting to see how the culture has changed. I mean, even people during the Great Depression after that time period slightly, they didn't even take government benefits, because that's like, oh, that's my neighbor's money. I shouldn't be taking my neighbor's money. And so the culture has changed drastically since that time.
I don't know if I agree. I actually think that if we go back to the pre-income tax era, or if we go back to a time before or during the Great Depression, I don't think human culture has necessarily changed that much. And I don't think it does anyone any good to have nostalgia for a time when unemployment was so much higher, when we were a much less prosperous society, and when poverty was so much higher. And yes, there were rich people who could do whatever they want, but we've always had that, and that's okay. Like it's
No, I'm
fundamentally
not saying
part
I
of
want to go
human
back
nature and
then.
society.
No, I'm
But
not.
it smells nostalgic. It's
No,
like
I mean, no,
pre
I don't want to go back
pre-income
there.
tax, we were all just
No,
like singing
no,
kumbaya,
no,
like taking
I
care
don't
of
want
each
to go
other.
back there. I mean, I just want to go back to no, I don't want to go back. I just want a free economy, and we had the economy was growing much faster back then. And so I mean, we had a much freer economy. Now the economy is still growing, and it still has grown a lot since then, because we still have some capitalism, we still have some freedom. But if you actually allowed the economy to grow the way it's supposed to, it'd be growing way faster than it is right now. And to some degree, it was, or to many degrees, it was spending less than 3% of GDP back then. And it was way better that way, of course. But I mean, that doesn't mean that I would rather go back there and live there. I mean, that's ridiculous. But anyway, I mean, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if people keep the majority of their income, if they keep more of their income, and they're able to use charities to privately do this much more efficiently, cost effectively, and in a way that you don't subsidize people who are supposed to be working but aren't working because they're just taking government benefits, and you see that quite often, is that's going to be much better for society, and it's going to be much better for communities where people are actually taking care of one another, with free of coercion. They're just, they're just, that's what you see. And you still see that to some degree today. As I said earlier, we still have a huge charity type of environment here in the United States today. But it would be much more so the case if you got rid of these exorbitant tax rates and government spending, which really is taxation. You would see a huge increase in private giving to charities and to organizations that help people who clearly can't get a job or clearly are poor. And you would see them actually being able to give money to them and help them get on the right footing. Now, does that mean everybody who's poor and disabled is going to be taken care of? No, that doesn't. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it'll be much better that way. I mean, even still today, people who are poor and unable to be taken care of don't get money. And so you're never going to have a perfect solution for this problem. As Thomas Sowell says, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And so you have to make a trade-off. Are you
That's
going
definitely.
to steal people's money, or are you going to allow people to peacefully cooperate with one another and figure out what's best? And so I think the latter is much better.
I think we've actually made a. This is a pretty good moment. I think we've pivoted pretty well to just the general idea of like social welfare or welfare state or uh, how we think about organizing society more generally and government more generally. And I would just say, like, it's just factually incorrect. We have we've run this experiment so many times for the last 50 years. Every time, basically every government, every president, every Congress has consistently cut taxes. Has that led to an equally uh, vast improvement? Has the gap of tax, like when we cut taxes, has that increased
Can I?
charity? Has that increased people's charitable giving? Like,
Yeah.
absolutely not. People are a little more generous on the margin, but absolutely not. We've reduced the marginal income taxes dramatically in the last 50 years, and we have not
Yeah.
seen this explosion of public philanthropy, of generosity. It's just not happening.
Well, the thing is the taxation, nominal tax rate doesn't tell the story. What tells the story is government spending, because government spending is taxation. The government has to steal the money from the public somehow if they spend money. Now, I want you to tell me over the past 50 years who cut government spending.
Well, government spending, definitely no one's
Yeah.
cutting
Well,
government
that's
spending.
taxation. So taxes went up. It's just that they funded themselves in a different way. I mean, regardless of whether or not taxes are rising or falling, nominal taxes, that's not what's important, really. What's important is to look at government spending, because they have to tax you in the first place to get.
Government spending and taxation are different. They are
Well,
different.
government spending fundamentally is taxation, because that's how the government gets money. And in truth, the government could just not collect taxes and print money. And you've seen that many times throughout history. The government just prints money to pay for its expenditures. And when that happens, the government is taxing the currency, the savers in the currency, instead of taxing you directly. They're just taxing.
Yeah, I think we're talking about different things. Government spending is not the same as taxation. I just
The government
for,
spending
clarify that before we
nominally,
continue.
the government spending nominally is not taxation. Government spending fundamentally is taxation, because in order for the government to spend in the first place, they have to tax their citizens. There's really two ways the government can fund themselves. They could either take your money directly through an income tax, a payroll tax, the corporate tax, however they want to do it, or they can take on debt. And there are plenty of people who could buy that debt, but the largest holder of United States debt, like it is
Yeah, yeah,
the Federal Reserve. So the Federal
yeah.
Reserve prints money, and they buy government bonds when the government runs a deficit, and they're just taxing the savers who hold dollars. Okay, so that's actually a
Yes.
tax. That's inflation.
Okay,
So
but I
regardless,
don't. I
regardless of
Go
how the
ahead,
government
continue.
funds themselves, or regardless of how the government spends their money, regardless, the government spending itself is taxation. But go ahead.
Uh, I understand philosophically where you're coming from with this point. I still think that there are very meaningful differences between government, like issuing bonds and issuing bonds, selling bonds to the Federal Reserve, and of course the interest on the bonds. And yes, this is another way of financing the state, but and it is in a way it's sort of the a backwards taxation on society, but it's not the same as taxes. And I think for the sake of our discussion, we are talking specifically, or what I thought you were mentioning was that if the government stops or reduces the burden of taxation on society via like reducing tax rates, for example, getting rid of payroll taxes, cutting taxes for everyone by like 10, 15%. Like you posited, if I recall correctly, a few minutes ago, that that would get out of the way and that would allow a more generous culture to emerge and a more efficient way of taking care of each other. And I just we've run this playbook like for the last 50 years we've been trying, and it's just factually incorrect. We have been cutting taxes consistently for the last, I mean, since since Reagan, we've been cutting taxes. Almost every government, every single president has signed some sort of tax cut. Okay, maybe not all of them, but most of them have signed tax cuts. They've increased the amount of money that Americans have in their pockets, and that has not correlated with massive increases in generosity. So we're not financing this. There's still lots of poor people, and of course, there's not necessarily ever going to be an end to poverty. But I don't think just getting rid of taxation is the solution, because we've tried this. We've tried this, and it's not worked.
No, we haven't tried it. What I'm saying is you're misconstruing, you're strawmanning this. I'm not saying to cut taxes nominally, not your tax rates. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying to cut government spending. If you cut government spending, then that, and people could keep more of their money, right? Because you could steal their money still by not taxing them, which is just or by not like taking their money. They could tax you with inflation tax. That's the inflation tax. They could still take your money, and so that you still have lost purchasing power, and it's basically the same thing, except it's just theft in a different silent way, and also it causes all sorts of economic problems that we could go over, but I think it's not necessary. But the idea is that the government spending is going up. The whole reason why do we have taxes in the first place? To pay for government. That's the only reason we have taxes. If there didn't need to be a government, we wouldn't have taxes. So government spending is just a function that needs to be paid for by taxpayers. And who are the taxpayers? The private sector is the taxpayers. The government isn't producing stuff. The private sector is. So they need to take that money from the private sector, and that's the only way they're able to spend in the first place, regardless of if they do it with inflation or they do it with whatever they want, or a direct tax, or just taking on debt. It doesn't. It's still a tax fundamentally. So anyway, if you see government spending go down, please let me know what happens to charitable donations. But we haven't seen that.
Well, you are correct that we have not seen any sustained serious government spending decreases in a long time. So I will give you that. But I also don't think that I still contest that just because the government is spending money, and just because it's spending money, basically borrowing from the future, essentially by printing bonds and selling debt to the American taxpayers backwards through the Federal Reserve and everything. That's not the same as taxation. It's not directly the same as taxation, and it's not in principle getting in the way of private philanthropy. And private philanthropy has always existed, and it's ebbed and flowed in different eras. And there's just no clear evidence that pre income taxes or pre the explosion of the government, that we were living in a much healthier, richer, happier society.
Yes, that's not what I'm saying.
There was more unfettered capitalism, but that on its own is not necessarily the absolute and only good. It is one of the goods, but it's not the only good. We still need to provide for people who need less. Like that's fundamentally why I'm a Democrat. I'm a liberal because I care about people, and I do care about efficiency, and that's why I think it's important. That's why I think it's really healthy to have two healthy parties, a conservative party that is actively looking to really let's be efficient. Let's do this well. Let's do this optimally. And I think we need to balance the efficiency with the compassion and find a middle ground there. And I don't think that we're suddenly, if the government were to reduce spending by 50%, we would see this just euphoria of generosity of people taking care of each other.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally the issue is that I think this with the government is going to absolutely suck at whatever they do. So that's the problem, and so Social Security is no different. We got all these Republicans cutting taxes. Well, they cut taxes, they increased spending, but your taxes really went up, just in a different way. So And you say you're a Democrat and you want to take care of people and all this. All of those welfare programs are literally name one Republican who's trying to abolish Social Security.
Well, currently there aren't that many. They are a
I
dying
can't think
breed.
of any. Like, I mean, maybe a couple,
They're
like
a
maybe
dying
two
breed.
or three, but almost all of them
That's,
want to keep Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And
no, and but I would say that's a fundamental like a problem in the both parties is that there's not a lot of like actual serious thinking because I would say that I really fundamentally disagree with you on axing the whole thing, but I do really believe that we need to revive some of the discussions that were happening in the like circa 2012 era when we had a bit more discussion about how we could make some of these institutions more sustainable because that's where I think I mean it's maybe right now it's a little bit lost in the politics of the current moment because no one is seriously talking about that. But yeah, but to double down on a point you mentioned before, I do not think that government is only ever bad. I think that's just such a like it's just such a common refrain that's not true. Like the government has created and just been able to support like so many great things, like so many amazing things only exist because the government like provided the seed capital or was able to support private investment in ways to make things happen. It organizes interest in a way that allows us to do really great things. And so, yes, you might say that, of course, we're taking money from the public private sector and like we're maybe not doing it as efficiently, but like we weren't going to put a man on the moon without the government organizing the energy for it. Like, yes, there's cool things that are going on, like lots of interesting private companies that are diving deep into space exploration, but they're fundamentally like relying on so much, like so much, like intellectual capital that was built up by government financing and government support and government investment in research and science and R&D. And like so much of this has happened and it just wouldn't be possible.
I mean, I this it's that's false, but it's fine. I think that we should I think we should end this conversation with Social Security, and that is
Okay.
that
Yeah.
so fundam Social Security is a Ponzi scheme once again that is poisonous to people who are working, who are subsidizing older, richer people, and it is taking capital away from the economy that otherwise would have been used for people to save for their retirement. It is helping to bankrupt the United States. And you're going to see the Social Security Trust Fund be depleted soon. You could try and say, oh, we need to reform the Ponzi scheme. We need to make a Ponzi scheme better. No, you need to get rid of the Ponzi scheme. The Ponzi scheme is a bad thing. So let's get rid of it. That's the idea. And you should return this back to voluntary cooperation by the private sector and for people who actually are responsible enough to save for their own retirement, which would be much better. And it would be much more easier and or much more easy and much more effective if the government wasn't confiscating money. And you would see a much better allocation of capital that way. And so all of these bonds that the government owns, who knows what's going to happen to them in the next 10 years or whatever? Who knows what's going to happen? I mean, all of these, how many baby boomers are projected to retire, and the lack of working people that are now there to support those older people. It's really a terrible situation. It's really just massive theft on a large scale. So I would love to see this. I would love to see this just be abolished, and we could all just burn a paper that says Social Security on it, throw it in a fire, and say goodbye because this is just absolutely destructive to society.
Um, well, just my final few words, I would say Social Security has been one of the most successful anti-poverty programs that has elevated hundreds of millions of Americans successfully out of poverty. Yes, it needs reform. Yes, we need to fix things. We need to fix the financing. We need to think about how we can make it more sustainable so that it can last for a long time in the future so that we can continue to benefit from it as we are benefiting from it today, whether we realize it or not. We want to live in a prosperous society where we can all benefit from the riches of this great nation. And I truly, truly, truly believe that together we can work on this. Together, it's going to take hard work. It's going to take Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals. It's going to take everybody. We all got to work together on this. No one party, no one political force has what it takes, has enough political capital, at least in this moment, to really address the problems that we need to address in order to make this sustainable. But I believe we can do it. And I think if we work hard And if we could see some sort of cooperation, I really do think we can continue the legacy of this really tremendously successful program that has helped hundreds of millions of working Americans.
All right. Well, I appreciate you joining, brother. Thanks for
Yeah, thank
tuning
you.
in with us.